A rich son discovered his sick father picking up garbage in front of his company. What he did next in front of all his employees left everyone speechless. Luke Martin sat in his black leather chair, slightly turning to gaze at the view from his office atop a skyscraper. Through the glass windows, the city unfolded like a sea of lights and movement, a metropolis that never slept, where he had achieved a peak that many could only dream of. The traffic's reflections twisted like rivers of fire under the night sky, and Luke, in his impeccably tailored suit, allowed himself a brief moment of pride. He had reached a place few could. On his polished wood desk, piles of documents and financial reports spoke of a thriving business, sealed contracts, and record-breaking numbers. Framed magazine articles adorned the walls. Luke Martin, the unstoppable tycoon, and the architect of his destiny. Each one was a reminder of the path he had taken to become the powerful figure he was now. Despite the opulence, a sense of unease occasionally enveloped him in moments of silence. The room, though full of luxurious items, resonated with a hollow and empty echo. Luke ignored it, as he always did, focusing his attention on the screen of his computer, where rising graphs and urgent emails filled the space. His phone vibrated on the table, a message notification from someone he hadn't responded to in weeks. Claire. His eyes lingered on the screen for a moment, feeling a pang of discomfort, but he quickly looked away and silenced the sound. Emotions were a distraction he couldn't afford. The door opened softly, and Alice, his assistant, peeked in. She wore a cordial smile, but in her eyes was the usual worry Luke always avoided acknowledging. "Luke," she said, with a warm yet professional tone. "Hector asked if you'll join the strategy meeting in 10 minutes. Luke nodded without looking away from his screen, though his thoughts began to drift. Hector, always so attentive, always so ambitious. Something in the way that man had been looking at him recently sparked an alert in the back of his mind. "Tell him I'll be there in a moment." Alice nodded and left, leaving Luke in the silence of his office. A silence that brought back memories he preferred not to evoke. A workshop with the scent of freshly cut wood, the laughter of a father covered in sawdust, and a pair of bright eyes looking at him with pride. He shook his head, closing the door to those thoughts and standing to head to the meeting. The business world was ruthless, and nostalgia had no place in it. As he walked through the glass and steel hallways of his company, the employees' glances shifted with respect and a certain distance. Luke Martin was an icon, but also an enigma, and in that blend of admiration and fear, he found the perfect refuge for his vulnerability. That day, however, the shadows he avoided began to hint at themselves in the corners of his mind, whispering that all success had a price, and that no matter how hard he tried to forget, his had one too. Miles away from the imposing skyscraper where Luke ran his empire, the neighborhood where Henry and Claire lived woke up to a completely different rhythm. The first lights of dawn filtered through the curtains of Henry's small house, illuminating the faded walls and worn-out furniture that told stories of decades of use. It was a modest home, but every corner was imbued with memories and the perseverance of a man who had built his life through effort and sacrifice. Henry, 65 years old, sat on the bed, his trembling hands and a persistent cough tearing at his throat. His eyes, though dull from fatigue, still held a glimmer of dignity and determination. He looked around, recognizing the traces of his work. A carved wooden table, a chair repaired so many times it was hard to count. His calloused hands reminded him of the years he worked long days as a carpenter, building structures and making furniture that still decorated distant homes. But now, those same muscles that once wielded hammer and chisel could barely hold a glass of water without shaking. Claire entered the room with light steps, carrying a tray with hot tea and medicine. Her dark hair, tied in a ponytail, showed signs of a sleepless night. Yet her eyes, though tired, glowed with unwavering warmth. With a soft smile, she placed the tray on the nightstand and helped her father sit more comfortably. "Good morning, Dad," she said, with a tone that hid her exhaustion. "Here's your tea. It'll help with the cough." Henry returned a weak smile and nodded. He looked at his daughter with a mix of gratitude and guilt, knowing how much she had sacrificed for him. Claire had given up opportunities and her own dreams to care for him, taking long shifts as a nurse at the nearby hospital. Every night she returned home with slumped shoulders and trembling hands. Henry felt a pang in his chest that wasn't just caused by the illness. "Claire, you don't have to do so much," Henry tried to say, but she interrupted him with a look that combined sweetness and firmness. "Don't say nonsense, Dad. Everything's fine," she replied, leaning in to kiss his forehead. "I have a long shift today, but I'll come by to see you in the afternoon, okay?" Henry nodded silently, unable to argue against his daughter's determination. When Claire left the room, the sound of the door closing behind her left an echo of loneliness. He stared at the ceiling, recalling brighter days, days when his home was filled with laughter and promises of a better future. The neighborhood began to wake up with its usual sounds: street vendors offering their goods, children running through the streets, and neighbors exchanging greetings. Among them, Raoul, Henry's friend and co-worker during his carpentry years, approached the house. At 68, Raoul walked with difficulty, but his jovial nature and loyalty hadn't been affected by the blows of life. He carried a bag with bread and fresh fruit, a gesture of help he never commented on, as he knew well his friend's pride. "Henry," Raoul greeted as he entered and saw his old companion. "I brought something for breakfast. Don't be stubborn. You know I won't take no for an answer." Henry smiled, and Raoul's presence brought an air of relief and camaraderie that made the house seem less empty. The two men, with the wrinkles marking their faces like scars from lived battles, shared a moment of silence, knowing that sometimes words were unnecessary. In Henry's mind, a recurring thought kept appearing. Luke, his oldest son, the one who had distanced himself from everything and everyone to pursue his dreams in the city. While there was pride for what he had accomplished, there was also the shadow of resentment for the years of distance and silence. And as Claire tried once again from the hospital to send a message to Luke, the screen of her phone continued to shine without response. The contrast between both worlds, Luke luxury and power, and the humility and daily struggle of Henry and Claire, became increasingly evident. But what neither of them knew was that this chasm was about to be challenged by a series of events that would change their lives forever. The city, with its endless maze of lights and movement, seemed to sleep under the starry sky. Yet, Luke Martin's office remained illuminated, casting a cold light at the top of the skyscraper. Inside, Luke sat alone, surrounded by the elongated shadows of his success, framed certifications, magazine covers, and crystal awards reflecting his tired and distant image. It had been a long day, filled with meetings and decisions shaping the company's future, but for him, they had started to lose their luster. Facing the vastness of the city, Luke allowed himself a rare moment of pause. His eyes, usually focused and analytical, drifted off into the distance. The blinking lights reminded him of a night in his childhood, when his father's workshop still echoed with the sound of tools and the scent of fresh wood filled the air. The memory came unexpectedly. Henry, in his sawdust-stained apron, laughing as he showed young Luke how to use a sander to smooth a piece of wood. "Hard work is what defines a man," his father had said, his eyes shining with pride. It was a warm memory, filled with laughter and a connection that, over time, had turned into a distant echo. The vibration of his phone broke the moment, and the screen lit up the darkness with a message from his sister Claire. Luke saw her name, and for a moment, his expression softened. But the pang of guilt forced him to look away and turn off the device. Work was his refuge, the place where emotions could not reach him. And that night, like so many others, he forced himself to forget, diving back into the papers covering his desk. The door opened slowly, and Alice, his trusted assistant, entered with a calm step. She carried a file in her hand, but her eyes reflected concern. She had worked alongside Luke for over a decade and knew the signs: the small tensions in his jaw, the faraway look in his eyes. "Luke, tomorrow is the charity event," she said, breaking the silence with a voice that sought to bring him back to the present. "It would be a good opportunity to—" She paused, measuring her words. "Show a more human side of the company, and of you." Luke slowly turned his chair to face her, his grey eyes, cold and calculating, reflecting a flicker of discomfort before hardening once more. "I'll attend tomorrow, Alice, you know that." "But that's it," he replied in a tone that closed the conversation before she could continue. Alice nodded, sensing that her attempt to reach him had once again been rejected. She left the office, leaving Luke alone once more, immersed in his thoughts. The silence returned, filling the space with memories that didn't ask for permission to come. Images of a simple house, the sound of Claire laughing as they played hide-and-seek in the backyard, and Henry calling him to dinner with a wide smile, the same man who now occupied a forgotten corner of his mind. Luke clenched his fists and shut his eyes, trying to smother the nostalgia that refused to disappear. The night continued, and the city kept breathing. But at the top of his skyscraper, Luke faced a battle that no contract or record number could solve. The fight against the memories and the echo of a family he had left behind. The hospital woke with the usual bustle of a new day. Fluorescent lights glowed with an impersonal shine, and the hallways were filled with murmurs, hurried steps, and the constant beeping of monitors. Claire, in her immaculate nurse uniform, but with a face marked by dark circles, moved efficiently between the beds. Each patient received a kind smile, a comforting gesture, despite the fact that her own strength seemed to diminish with each passing shift. She had spent the night caring for a child with a high fever and assisting in an emergency operation. The hours accumulated in her feet, and the weight of worry for her father made her feel like fatigue had settled in her bones. Still, she kept to her routine, with the unwavering determination of someone who had made responsibility her refuge. Amid the whirlwind of the shift, James, a young doctor with a compassionate gaze and calm voice, watched her from the end of the hall. He had worked with Claire long enough to admire her dedication and the sacrifice she made every day. Their interactions had been brief and professional, but James began to notice details that others overlooked, how her hands trembled at the end of her shift, or how she would sit in silence staring at her phone screen, waiting for a message that never came. Taking advantage of a quiet moment, James approached with a cup of hot coffee. Claire, who was reviewing patient reports, looked up and weakly smiled when she saw the offer. She knew James was kind to everyone, but this time she felt something different in the warmth of his gesture. "Take a break, Claire," said James, extending the cup. "You need it more than anyone here." Claire hesitated for a moment. The coffee smelled like a promise of energy, but beyond that, the simple fact that someone cared about her tightened her throat. She accepted the cup and nodded, lowering her gaze to hide the emotion threatening to surface. "Thank you, James." "Really?" she responded in a voice that tried to sound calm. James sat next to her, respecting the space between them, but still observing her. His eyes studied her with a mix of concern and admiration that had been growing for some time. Though Claire always kept a strong facade, James could see the cracks the exhaustion and worry had left. "How's your father?" he asked gently, knowing it was a sensitive topic. Claire let out a sigh, lowering the cup to massage her temples. "Fighting, like always. I do what I can, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough." The confession slipped out before she could stop it. It was a truth she hadn't allowed herself to voice, a truth she had kept hidden beneath her skin, fueled by sleepless nights and the weight of her responsibilities. "You're doing more than anyone could, Claire," James replied softly. "And you're not alone, even though it may seem like it." His words had an unexpected effect. For a moment, Claire felt the wall she had built around herself begin to crack. She didn't want anyone to see her as weak, least of all someone like James, whose respect she valued deeply. But in that moment, under the cold lights of the hospital and with the warmth of the coffee in her hands, she allowed a small part of her armor to relax. The intercom's sound interrupted the moment, calling James to the emergency room. He stood up, but before leaving, gave her one last look that spoke more than words could express. Claire watched him walk away, a warm feeling in her chest that contradicted the exhaustion she felt. That day, as she attended to her patients and prepared to head home, Claire thought about James's words. She wasn't alone. Though the burden still weighed heavily, knowing that someone else saw and understood her struggle made the night feel a little less dark. Without knowing it, the seed of unexpected support was beginning to sprout amid the daily struggle. And though Claire didn't fully recognize it yet, that small spark would prove crucial in the days ahead, when life would challenge her with even greater obstacles. The first lights of dawn were just beginning to illuminate the city when Luke arrived at his office. With a cup of coffee in hand and the echo of his steps on the marble floor, he headed to the conference room where a small group of executives was waiting. The day promised to be intense, filled with strategies and decisions that would directly impact the company's expansion plans. Hector, one of the most ambitious executives, was already sitting at the opposite end of the table, reviewing documents with a self-assured smile. With his designer suits and confident air, Hector had climbed the company ranks quickly and methodically. His sharpness and ability to spot opportunities, even questionable ones, made him a valuable yet dangerous asset. Luke entered the room and caught Hector's calculating gaze, a silent exchange that spoke of rivalries and unspoken competition. Luke sat down and began the meeting, presenting reports and discussing upcoming market strategies. As he spoke, he noticed Hector watching him with a mixture of interest and something else, something bordering on expectation. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone present was aware of an underlying chess game being played beneath the surface of numbers and graphs. When it was Hector's turn to speak, he did so with his characteristic calm and measured voice, but there was an undertone that Luke couldn't overlook. "It's crucial that we become more aggressive with our investment and expansion policies," Hector said, bringing up a graph on the screen. "The competition is advancing, and if we want to maintain our position, we need to take calculated risks." The words "calculated risks" echoed in Luke's mind like a warning. Over the last few months, Hector had promoted policies that, while initially profitable, were starting to show ethical cracks that concerned Luke. However, the company had grown at such a rapid pace that stopping to evaluate the details seemed like a weakness he couldn't afford. Alice, who was sitting at the end of the table taking notes, watched the interaction closely. She, more than anyone, understood the complexity of the situation. She knew Hector was more than just an ambitious executive. He was a veiled threat, someone who had learned to play with perception and manipulation. Alice had started noticing unusual financial movements, transactions that raised red flags and suggested something darker than Luke could imagine. At the end of the meeting, Hector approached Luke with his trademark smile. "Luke, I know some of my proposals may seem risky, but I trust you'll see the opportunities where others only see dangers," he said, his tone wavering between camaraderie and provocation. Luke held his gaze and nodded non-committally, feeling the knot of distrust in his stomach tighten a little more. His intuition told him that Hector was planning something bigger, something that could change the direction of the company and potentially his life. After the other executives left the room, Alice approached Luke. "There's something you should see," she said, leaving a report on the table. "These are recent transactions that don't match the company's protocols." Luke took the report and reviewed it in silence, his expression hardening as he read. "Keep investigating, Alice," he said in a low voice. "I want to know exactly what's going on here." Alice nodded, knowing the coming days would be decisive. Hector's shadow loomed over the company, and Luke, despite his apparent control, was beginning to realize that he had underestimated the complexity of the challenge before him. The sun was just rising over the horizon, casting a faint light over the worn streets of the neighborhood. Henry sat on his bed, watching as the first rays of light filled the room with a melancholic glow. The cough that had plagued him for months scraped his throat once again, reminding him how fragile he had become. He rubbed his face, feeling the roughness of his wrinkles and the tremor that he could no longer hide. He was the same man who had once worked tirelessly to give his children a future. But now, that strength had transformed into a shadow of what it once was. The sound of the coffee machine in the kitchen made him smile faintly. Claire, like every morning, had woken up before the sun to prepare something hot for him before heading to the hospital. His daughter, with the determination and love that defined her, had become his pillar, the engine that kept the house running. And although Henry appreciated every sacrifice, guilt ate at him from within. He didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to see Claire wear herself out while her own youth faded in exhausting shifts and constant worries. That morning, an idea that had been brewing in his mind finally took shape. He got up with effort, holding onto the edge of the bed to steady himself. He dressed slowly in simple, somewhat worn clothes, and went out to the backyard, where the old tool cart he had used during his years as a carpenter rested, now a mere reminder of better days. He pushed it with trembling hands down the street, ignoring the protest of his muscles. The neighborhood was starting to wake up, with the sound of doors opening and the voices of street vendors greeting the first customers of the day. Henry walked slowly, feeling the gaze of some neighbors fall on him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Doña Marta, who was sweeping the sidewalk in front of her house, watched him with a furrowed brow. "Where are you going so early, Henry?" she asked, stopping her sweeping to approach. Henry forced a smile and raised a hand to reassure her. "Just seeing if I can find something to do, Doña Marta. Don't worry." The woman looked at him with eyes full of understanding and pity, but said nothing more. She knew Henry's pride wouldn't allow him to accept help, at least not directly. He continued walking until he reached a small square where the men who sought odd jobs usually gathered. Some were loading boxes at the market, others cleaned the streets for a few coins. Henry, who had once been a master carpenter, now stood in line, waiting for any task he could do. Beside him, Raoul appeared without a sound, a bag of bread in hand and a look of resignation on his face. "Always so stubborn, Henry," Raoul said, breaking the silence. Henry let out a dry laugh and looked at his old friend. "I can't stay at home while Claire works day and night. I can't." Raoul nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. The silence between the two men spoke of years of friendship and mutual respect that transcended words. The first job Henry got was collecting papers and trash from a small market. His hands shook as he pushed a rusty garbage cart, and each step reminded him of how far he had fallen from the strong, vigorous man who once built furniture for demanding clients and proudly taught Luke and Claire the value of hard work. But the physical pain didn't matter as much as the desire to contribute, to lighten even a little the burden his daughter carried alone. Hours passed, and Henry's body began to feel the toll of his effort. But he still refused to stop. The murmurs of the neighbors, the looks of admiration and concern, and Raoul's constant presence, never leaving his side, were witnesses to the silent battle he fought, the struggle against illness, old age, and above all, the pride that drove him to keep going for the love of his daughter. As Henry worked, Claire finished her shift at the hospital, unaware that her father was pushing his body to its limits for her. And on the other side of the city, Luke, oblivious to it all, was reviewing contracts and attending meetings, never imagining that the decisions he had made years ago and the distance he had kept were bringing him closer to a reunion that would force him to face the truths he had long avoided. That afternoon, Henry returned home with a few coins in his pocket and an exhaustion that made him stagger. But in his chest, though sore, he felt a spark of renewed dignity, one that made him feel, for a brief moment, less like a burden and more like the man he once was. The hospital was in its busiest hour. Nurses and doctors walked quickly through the hallways, and the sound of monitors and patient voices filled the air. Claire, after a long day attending to emergency cases, allowed herself a moment of rest in the small break room. She collapsed into a chair, resting her head in her hands, feeling the exhaustion stretch through her body. Her eyes, red from lack of sleep, reflected a mix of tiredness and worry. She pulled out her phone and, for the umpteenth time, checked if there was any response from Luke. For weeks, she had been sending him messages, first with updates on their father's health, then simply trying to maintain a bridge of contact. But each message went unanswered, an echo lost in the whirlwind of Luke's life. The last message she had sent 2 days ago was a simple plea. "Luke, Dad is getting worse. It would be good if you came to see him. He needs you. I need you." Claire sighed as she remembered the words, feeling the frustration and pain of her brother's indifference. Watching Henry fight every day, struggling not to be a burden, made Luke's absence feel even heavier. At that moment, James entered the room, noticing Claire's expression and the way she held the phone with a mixture of hope and resignation. "Bad news?" he asked, though his voice carried a quiet understanding. Claire looked up and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, just waiting for a message from someone," she said, setting the phone aside with a sharp movement, trying to avoid the topic. James sat down across from her, observing her with the same calm gaze that had supported her during the toughest days. He knew Claire was strong, that she carried an immense weight without complaint, but he also knew that even the strongest people need a break. "Claire, I know what you're doing for your father and for your patients is admirable, but you have to remember that you also need to take care of yourself," he said, his voice soft but firm. Claire nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, in a place where a brother answered her calls, where a family, though broken, could unite for the sake of someone they both loved. "Sometimes I think it's like talking to a wall," she admitted quietly. "Luke, he's changed so much. Success took him away from everything, from us. And meanwhile, here we are, trying to keep afloat what's left." James leaned forward, placing his hand over Claire's, and in that silent gesture, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't say anything more, because words couldn't ease the burden Claire felt. But the gesture reminded her that, even though Luke was absent, she wasn't completely alone. The evening arrived, and Claire returned home to find Henry asleep in his old armchair, the TV on but muted. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper, marked by exhaustion and pain, and for a moment, Claire felt that the daily struggle was an impossible mountain to climb. Yet, she approached him, turned off the TV, and draped a blanket over his shoulders, planting a soft kiss on his forehead. While her father slept, Claire took her phone once more, and though she knew she likely wouldn't receive a response, she sent one last message. "Luke, Dad needs you. It's time to come home." The phone remained silent, and on the other side of the city, in an office lit by moonlight and surrounded by the constant hum of the city, Luke saw the notification appear on his screen. But, as so many times before, he ignored it and let it pass, diving once again into the web of charts and contracts, trying to drown out the voices that reminded him of what he had left behind. The headquarters of Luke Martin's company was bathed in warm lights and elegantly decorated for the annual charity event. The glass doors reflected the suits and dresses of the guests, while a red carpet led the way into the building, where waiters with trays of champagne moved skillfully between conversations and sophisticated laughter. The main room, with its high ceilings and large windows offering spectacular views of the city, had been transformed into a stage of luxury and success, a testament to the power and influence Luke had accumulated over the years. Luke, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit and a meticulously practiced smile, walked among the guests, shaking hands and offering carefully chosen words. His movements were confident, his posture upright, and every gesture calculated to project the image of an indomitable leader. However, in the depths of his eyes, those who knew him well could have noticed a shadow of distraction. As he moved from conversation to conversation, his mind wandered, and the image of an unanswered message glowed uncomfortably at the edge of his consciousness. Alice, his trusted assistant, observed Luke from a corner of the room, overseeing the event with a critical eye. Her elegant dress did little to hide the concern in her gaze. She had worked alongside Luke for so long that she could read his emotions even when he tried to hide them. Tonight, something about him seemed more tense than usual, as though an invisible pressure were pushing him to the edge. "Everything's under control, right, Alice?" asked an executive as he passed by her. "Yes, everything is going well," she replied, without taking her eyes off Luke. The evening continued smoothly. Despite the unease following him, Luke played his part as the host, offering smiles and nodding with feigned interest to stories and comments. Conversations about new projects and collaborations filled the air, but for him, they were little more than background noise. He glanced at the front door as though expecting something or someone to appear. Then, in the midst of the buzz, a small commotion became apparent at the entrance. Some guests started turning their heads, intrigued by what seemed to be a confrontation between a security guard and an elderly man, hunched over, wearing worn-out clothes. The elderly man was pushing a garbage cart, his hands trembling, and his breathing was heavy, even from a distance. Luke felt a knot form in his stomach as he recognized that figure. It was Henry, his father. Time seemed to stop. The voices of the guests dropped to a murmur of expectation. Alice, realizing what was happening, quickly moved forward to intervene, but Luke was already walking toward the entrance, feeling every step as though it were in slow motion. "Sir, you need to leave," the security guard was saying to the elderly man, a mix of impatience and confusion in his tone. Henry, tired and worn from the day's efforts, looked up. His eyes, still filled with dignity, met Luke's. A mix of emotions crossed Henry's face: surprise, sadness, pride. He tried to speak, but the words got caught in his throat when a violent cough shook him, bending him in half. The garbage bags fell to the floor with a dull thud, and Henry staggered, struggling to stay on his feet. Luke stopped, unable to move, his gaze fixed on the figure of his father. The scene, which in any other context would have seemed absurd, struck him with a force that left him paralyzed. The memory of past nights in the workshop, the stories of sacrifice, and the moments when Henry had been his hero surged through him like lightning. Alice reached the scene, and a security guard stepped forward to offer help. But before anyone could do anything, Henry collapsed onto the floor. The sound of his body hitting the marble echoed through the room, and the murmurs of the guests stopped. The silence was absolute, heavy, as if everyone were holding their breath. At that moment, the door to the room opened with a bang, and Claire entered, her face pale and her chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. She had received a call from Raoul a few minutes earlier and had run without thinking. When she saw her father on the floor and Luke standing motionless in the midst of the crowd, her emotions overwhelmed her. "Dad!" Claire knelt beside Henry, checking his vital signs with expert but trembling hands. Luke's eyes met his sister's. There were no words, only a tension laden with everything left unsaid over the years. The judgment in Claire's gaze was clear and final. For the first time in a long time, Luke felt completely exposed. Alice broke the tension, calling for an ambulance while the event's guests watched the scene, some with compassion and others with silent judgment. The image of Luke, the unstoppable magnate, was crumbling before their eyes, as the weight of reality and the past struck him with full force. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its lights flashing, cutting through the tense silence that had enveloped the event. The guests quickly moved aside to make way for the paramedics, who entered with determined and professional steps. Claire, her face soaked in tears and her body shaking from exhaustion and fear, held her father's hand as the paramedics prepared the stretcher. "Stay calm, Dad. I'm here," she whispered, trying to make her voice sound calm despite the panic she felt. Henry, semi-conscious, weakly squeezed Claire's hand, a gesture laden with more meaning than words could express. Luke remained at the entrance, watching the scene as though he were observing it from outside his own body. The murmurs of the guests filled the air, some commenting quietly on what had happened, while others exchanged uncomfortable and compassionate glances. Alice, ever efficient, had taken control of the situation, ensuring that the nearest guests kept a respectful distance and organizing the exit of the event with a discretion that only she knew how to handle. "Mr. Martin," one of the paramedics addressed Luke, pulling him from his stupor. "If you're a relative of the patient, you should accompany us to the hospital." Luke swallowed, feeling the words choke in his throat. He nodded slowly, and after a moment of hesitation, walked toward where Claire and Henry were being taken toward the ambulance. Claire briefly looked at him, her gaze filled with pain and reproach. There were no words. The emotional distance between them was palpable, even in such a critical moment. Raoul, who had arrived just minutes after Claire, observed from the edge of the crowd with pursed lips and teary eyes. He knew that this moment would mark a turning point in the family's history. With a mixture of pride and sadness, he watched the ambulance drive off, taking Henry and his 2 children with it. The ride to the hospital was silent, broken only by the murmur of the monitors and Henry's heavy breathing. Claire kept her hand over her father's, while Luke, sitting on the opposite side, watched as the life he had left behind collapsed before him. He remembered all the times he had ignored Claire's messages, the calls unanswered, and the memories he had buried beneath a mountain of success and obligations. The cracks in the facade he had built over so many years were beginning to widen. Upon arrival at the hospital, Claire moved with the familiarity of someone who knew every hallway and every procedure. James, who was on shift that night, saw her enter and immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. He rushed toward her, and when he saw Henry on the stretcher, his heart sank. "Claire, what happened?" he asked, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "A crisis." "He was weak, collapsed at the event's entrance," she replied, her voice shaking, not looking away from her father. Luke, who stood a few steps away, watched the interaction with a mix of jealousy and relief. Seeing James so close to Claire, with a look of genuine support and concern, reminded him how distant he had become from his family, how his place had been taken by someone else who was willing to be present. The doctors took Henry to an observation room, and Claire stood by the door, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the floor. Luke approached, but before he could say anything, she spoke without looking at him. "Do you realize what we've been through without you?" she asked in a voice so low it seemed more like a thought spoken aloud than a question directed at him. Luke tried to respond, but he found no words. The weight of guilt and shame crushed him, leaving him speechless. James returned a few minutes later to speak with Claire. His eyes reflected the professionalism of a doctor, but also the empathy of a friend. "He's stable, but he needs rest and intensive care. The situation is delicate, Claire." She nodded, letting out a sigh that sounded like both relief and exhaustion. She turned to look at Luke, her eyes red and her face marked with worry. "If you're here to stay, then act like you care. Because if not, you might as well leave," she said, with a harshness that struck Luke harder than any words he had ever heard. Luke looked at her, seeing in his sister a strong woman, a woman who had borne what he had ignored. And in that moment, he understood that not only did Henry need saving, but so did he, rescued from the prison he had built with ambition and pride. The hours in the hospital waiting room seemed to stretch as if time had stopped. Claire sat in one of the plastic chairs, her hands clasped together, her gaze lost at some point on the wall. James came over now and then to check on her, but Claire responded with a weak smile and a nod that tried to convey calmness. Luke stood nearby, a few steps away from his sister, unsure of what to do or how to behave. The discomfort between them was palpable, and the whispers of conversations and the announcements over the hospital intercom only accentuated the heavy silence between them. He felt a void in his stomach, a mix of nervousness and guilt that made him want to speak, but the words eluded him. Finally, Claire broke the silence without turning her head toward him. "How much longer are you going to stay silent, Luke?" she asked, her voice tired but firm. "How much longer are you going to ignore what really matters?" Luke swallowed and looked down, searching for an answer in the cold tiles. He had spent years perfecting the art of evading emotions, of running from the memories that confronted him with his past. But in that moment, all the barriers he had built seemed useless. "It's not that I don't care, Claire," he finally responded, his voice shaky and barely a whisper. "I just didn't know how to come back." Claire turned slowly, meeting his eyes. In them, Luke saw a mix of pain, disappointment, and something deeper. The shadow of hope that refuses to die, even when it's on the verge of disappearing. "You didn't know how to come back," she repeated, letting out a brief, bitter laugh. "Luke, while you were up there, in your world of offices and contracts, we were down here, fighting every day. Not just for Dad, but for the memory of what used to be our family." Luke felt the blow of every word. He remembered the nights when he ignored Claire's calls, the meetings where his thoughts wandered back to his childhood, and the messages he had dismissed, each one a missed opportunity to reconnect. "Claire, I'm sorry," he admitted, lifting his gaze and allowing the vulnerability to show on his face. "I'm sorry for pulling away, for not being here. I thought that if I worked harder, if I had more success, I'd prove something to myself, to Dad." For a moment, Claire's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her eyes before the pain reaffirmed itself. "It's not success we needed, Luke. We needed you. Dad needed his son, and I needed my brother." Suddenly, the door to the observation room opened, and James peeked his head in. The tension on his face made both siblings stand up immediately. "You can go in," James said, his tone more relaxed than before. "Henry is conscious, but he's very weak. Just a few minutes for now." Claire and Luke entered the room, where Henry lay in bed, pale and fragile, tubes connected to his arm and a monitor showing a slow but steady rhythm. His eyes slowly opened, and when he saw his children, a shadow of emotion crossed his face. Claire approached and took her father's hand, while Luke, with uncertain steps, stopped at the opposite side of the bed. Henry looked at them, his breath labored, his words barely a murmur. "My children, together," he said in a broken voice, a tear escaping his tired eyes. "I thought I wouldn't see this again." Luke felt a sharp pang of regret pierce through him. He had avoided this moment for so long, afraid of facing the truths and emotions that had pushed him away. But here he was, with his sister and his father, and for the first time in years, he understood that the lost time could only be recovered through the present. "I'm here, Dad," Luke said, his voice cracking as he placed a trembling hand on Henry's. "And I'm not leaving again." Henry's gaze settled on his son, and a small glimmer of pride and acceptance appeared in his eyes. There was no need for more words. What had been broken couldn't be repaired in an instant, but the first step, the hardest one, had been taken. Claire watched the scene and felt how a part of the weight she had carried for years lightened, even if only a little. For the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope in that hospital room, a reminder that, although the road ahead was long and complicated, reconciliation was possible. The hospital clock read 2 a.m. The waiting room had emptied out a bit, but the air still carried a tension that seemed almost tangible. Claire remained by her father's bedside, watching as Henry drifted into an uneasy sleep. The lights on the monitor next to the bed blinked with a steady rhythm, and the hum of the machines filled the space with an almost hypnotic sound. Beside her, Luke stood still, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts racing through his mind. The silence between the siblings was thick. Claire, though exhausted, couldn't afford to rest. The presence of Luke, who had remained distant for so many years, added an emotional weight that made her feel as though she was on the verge of breaking. And yet, A part of her wondered if her brother, the same one who had ignored their family and lost himself in his own world of success, would finally understand what he had left behind. "How long has he been like this?" Luke asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, laden with guilt. Claire glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, her expression a mixture of fatigue and skepticism. The shadows under her eyes were deep, and the light from the screen reflected the tension in her face. "Too long," she responded, not bothering to soften her words. "The last time I tried to call you to tell you about his health problems, you didn't answer. Remember? It was over a year ago." Luke closed his eyes for a moment, feeling each of Claire's words cut through him like a knife. He remembered that call. He remembered how he had watched the phone vibrate on his desk while he discussed an important contract, the kind of contract that could define a career, and how he had decided that answering could wait. But the truth was, it wasn't just about that call. It was a collection of similar moments, choices where he had prioritized success over everything else, accumulating an emotional debt that now weighed on him like a yoke. "Claire, I know what I did was wrong, and I know saying it now doesn't change anything, but—" Claire interrupted him, her voice harsher than she had intended. "What do you want, Luke? To redeem yourself with a couple of hospital visits and a few apologies? It's not that simple. Dad has been suffering, and I've been alone, trying to hold it all together while you carried on with your life as if we didn't exist." Luke lowered his head, his sister's words like an echo of his own conscience. He looked at Henry, whose face, though serene in sleep, bore the scars of a life of sacrifice. The memory of his father working in his shop, crafting furniture with patience and skill that Luke had always admired, hit him hard. That same man, who had once lifted him on his shoulders and promised that nothing would tear them apart, now lay fragile and silent, while Luke struggled to remember the last time they had truly spoken. "I'm not here just out of guilt, Claire. I'm here because I've realized that everything I chased, everything I thought was important, means nothing if I can't be here with you," Luke said, his voice trembling for the first time in years. Claire stared at him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds were deep, and time could not be reversed. "And what are you going to do now, Luke?" she asked, not so much as a challenge, but as a test. She wanted to see if her brother was capable of acting, not just speaking. Before Luke could respond, the door to the room opened, and James entered with his steady, albeit tired, pace. His gaze went to Claire first, as it always did, and then to Luke, with a mixture of respect and caution. "Claire, Dad is stable for now, but there are complications we need to monitor. The latest tests show that the damage to his lungs is worse than we thought. He'll need more intensive care and probably additional treatments," James explained, with a professional yet kind tone. Claire nodded, biting her lip to prevent the tears from rising again. She knew the cost of those treatments would be astronomical, something her salary as a nurse couldn't cover. And while James's help had been invaluable, even he had his limits. She couldn't ask more from him than he had already given. Luke, who had remained silent until then, cleared his throat. "James, what kind of care does my father need? I want to know exactly what it entails, and—" He paused, looking at Claire. "I want to help, no matter the cost." The doctor blinked, surprised by Luke's direct offer. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for Claire's reaction. She crossed her arms and exhaled slowly, looking at Luke with eyes searching for the truth behind his words. "Why now, Luke?" she finally asked, without raising her voice, but with a weight that made the question more forceful. Luke stepped forward, still feeling the distance between them like a chasm. "Because now I understand what I lost by stepping away, and what it would mean to lose it forever. I don't want this to be the end of our story, Claire. I want to do what's right, even if it's late." The silence that followed was tense and thick. James, sensing the moment was too personal, discreetly withdrew, leaving the siblings alone with Henry, whose breathing had slowed as if the presence of his children together brought him some peace. Claire looked at Luke for a moment more, and finally her posture relaxed a little. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a truce. "We'll take care of him, Luke. But if you're really here, show it with actions, not just words," she said, taking the first step toward a bridge that still needed to be built. Luke nodded, knowing that words were only the beginning. And as the night continued and the hospital lights flickered, a glimmer of hope began to grow amidst the scars of the past. The dawn arrived in the city as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. Luke had spent the night at the hospital with Claire and Henry, watching as his father drifted into restless sleep beneath the cold, constant lights of the room. Though fatigue weighed heavily on his eyelids, a new determination had sparked within him. He knew that if he was truly going to make things right, he couldn't just be a temporary presence in his family's life. He needed to face the problems that had kept him away and bring order to his world. After exchanging a few words with Claire, who finally agreed to take a brief rest in the hospital break room, Luke left at dawn for his office. The drive was silent, accompanied only by the monotonous hum of the engine and his thoughts. The city, still half asleep, watched him with blinking lights and empty streets, like a witness to his decisions and the paths he had taken. When he arrived at the building, the office lights were just beginning to turn on, and the early staff was already moving through the hallways, preparing for the day. Luke, with his wrinkled shirt and face marked by lack of sleep, walked toward his office without stopping to exchange greetings. The employees, surprised by his arrival at this hour, exchanged curious glances and murmurs. "Is everything okay?" asked Marta, the receptionist, with a mix of concern and respect. "Yes, Marta, just a different kind of day," Luke replied with a forced smile as he continued walking. When he reached his office, he found Alice waiting for him. She had worked late the night before, and upon seeing Luke enter, she raised an eyebrow, surprised by his disheveled appearance and the exhaustion in his eyes. "Luke, is everything okay?" she asked, her professional tone laced with concern. Luke nodded and dropped his briefcase onto the desk. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Hector and his recent activities," he said directly, without hesitation. Alice studied him for a moment, evaluating his expression before slowly nodding. "I've been gathering information, but what I have isn't pleasant. Hector has been handling contracts and accounts in a way that, if you look closely, shows suspicious deviations. Not only that, but there are policies he's implemented without your approval, under the excuse of being urgent measures to protect the company." Luke slumped into his chair, rubbing his face as he tried to process the information. He had been aware of Hector's ambitions, but he hadn't anticipated the magnitude of the potential damage. "Give me all the documents you have. I want to see every contract, every transaction. I need to understand how this slipped under my roof," he ordered, his voice low and determined. Alice nodded and handed him a thick folder she had prepared in the past few weeks. Luke opened it and began to go through the documents. The first pages showed seemingly legitimate contracts, but as he went further, the discrepancies became more evident. Inflated invoices, subcontracting to dubious companies, and accounts diverting funds to non-existent projects. Each page was a blow to his credibility, a reminder of how he had allowed ambition and blind trust to take him away from the principles his father had taught him. As Luke read, Alice sat across from him and continued speaking. "Luke, Hector hasn't just been misdirecting funds. I've spoken with some of the older employees, and there are rumors that he's been using his influence to intimidate and silence those who question his methods. I know you put him in a position of power because of his ability to close deals, but I think we underestimated how far he would go." Luke looked up from the documents, his jaw tightening as the fatigue in his eyes turned into contained fury. Alice observed him in silence, waiting for him to process the information before continuing. "We need to take action," Luke finally said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Call a meeting of the executive committee for this afternoon. I want everyone involved present, and I want you with me when we confront Hector." Alice nodded firmly. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that the real challenge wasn't just uncovering the truth, but confronting it and acting on it. The hours until the meeting passed in a blur. Luke locked himself in his office, reviewing every document and preparing a detailed presentation. Images of his father, Henry, who had always taught him that integrity was the most important thing, even if it meant facing difficult consequences, came to his mind. The memory of those lessons strengthened him, giving him the resolve he needed for what was to come. At 3 in the afternoon, the boardroom was full. The faces of the executives displayed varying degrees of intrigue and anxiety. Hector, sitting at the far end of the table, wore a confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. His relaxed posture seemed to say that he controlled the situation, that nothing could touch him. Luke entered, followed by Alice, and took his place at the head of the table. His gaze swept the room, briefly stopping on Hector, who raised an eyebrow with a mix of challenge and curiosity. "Thank you all for coming," Luke began, his voice firm and controlled. "Today, we are going to discuss something that can no longer wait. In recent weeks, Alice has been reviewing documents and contracts that raise serious concerns about the integrity of our operations." The tension in the room immediately increased. Hector stopped smiling, and his expression hardened. Luke continued, displaying details of manipulated transactions and contracts on the screen. "Here you can see the evidence of diverted funds, fake projects, and inflated contracts. These are not mistakes. These are deliberate actions that compromise the ethics and stability of our company." "Hector, I would like you to explain this," he said, turning his gaze toward the man at the end of the table. The silence was dense for a moment. Hector crossed his arms, his face now a mask of disdain. "Luke, I'm surprised you've called everyone here just for a show like this," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The contracts you're showing were necessary to keep the company growing. Maybe they're unconventional, but they were effective." Luke slammed the papers onto the table with a dull thud. "Effective at filling your pockets at the expense of the company and the people who trust us. This isn't just a lack of ethics, Hector. It's corruption, and it has no place here." The murmurs in the room intensified. Some executives looked at each other, surprised, while others nodded in silence, as if everything they had suspected was finally coming to light. Hector stood up abruptly, slamming both hands on the table. "So, this is a witch hunt, Luke? You think you're superior by sitting there and judging me. But you know as well as I do that in this business, no one stays clean entirely." Luke watched him with a mix of pity and determination. "There may be times when we all have to make tough decisions, but there's a line that shouldn't be crossed. You crossed it, and now you'll face the consequences." Alice, who had remained silent, spoke with a firm tone that surprised everyone. "Hector, your actions not only jeopardize the company, but everyone who depends on it. And here, that won't be tolerated." Security was called, and Hector was escorted out of the room, his gaze filled with a cold fury that promised this situation wouldn't end there. The executives exchanged looks of astonishment and relief, while Luke slumped into his chair, feeling for the first time in a long time that he had done the right thing, even if the road ahead was uncertain and difficult. That evening, when Luke returned to the hospital, he found Claire sitting next to Henry's bed, gently stroking his father's hand. When Luke entered, she looked at him with tired eyes, but the shadow of a smile appeared on her face. "How did it go?" she asked, as if she knew something important had happened. Luke sat beside her and sighed. "Hard, but necessary," he replied. And for the first time, he felt those words not only described what had happened in the office, but also the journey he was willing to take to repair the bonds that had been broken. The news of Hector's dismissal and the internal purge at Luke's company spread quickly among the employees and business circles of the city. Opinions were mixed. Some saw it as an act of justice, while others viewed it as a move that could endanger the company's stability. However, within the office, an atmosphere of relief and expectation had settled, while Luke, alongside Alice, worked to reorganize and strengthen the company's structure. That morning, after a sleepless night reviewing documents and overseeing changes in internal protocols, Luke received an unexpected call in his office. It was Raoul. The voice of Henry's old friend was deep and measured, as if he were carefully weighing each word before speaking. "Luke, I know you're busy, but we need to talk. I can't wait any longer," Raoul said without preamble. Luke felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't seen Raoul in years, but he remembered well the man who had been like an uncle to him and Claire during their childhood. Raoul's voice carried with it memories of afternoons spent in Henry's workshop, of laughter, stories, and lessons that had been lost in time. "Sure, Raoul. Come to the office when you can," Luke replied, unsure of what to expect. A few hours later, Luke was looking out the window of his office, his thoughts tangled in the recent upheavals in his life, when the sound of the door opening broke his reverie. He turned and saw Raoul, a man with grey hair and a face weathered by time and work, standing in the doorway. His eyes were warm, but there was a seriousness in them that allowed for no misinterpretation. "Raoul, thanks for coming," Luke said, extending his hand. Raoul shook Luke's hand firmly, but he didn't sit down immediately. He took a moment to survey the office, the elegant furniture, the awards and accolades hanging on the walls. "This is impressive, Luke. Your father would be proud, though." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "He'd also have things to say to you." Luke slightly flinched under the weight of the implication. He knew Raoul wasn't there to talk about business or flatter him. "I know I haven't been in touch, neither with Dad nor with you. But that's changing, Raoul. I'm trying to make things right," Luke said, his tone attempting to convey sincerity. Raoul nodded, but his gaze reflected more compassion than approval. "I know you're trying, and I respect that. But there are things you need to hear, not just for you, but for your father, for what he represented, and what he did for you and your sister." Luke frowned and sat down, inviting Raoul to do the same. The older man settled into the chair across from the desk and took a deep breath before beginning. "When your father built the first offices for this company, you were just a kid. But what you don't know is how he managed to do it. Most nights, after working in the workshop, Henry would come here and work until dawn, not just because he wanted to, but because money was tight, and he needed to secure a future for you and Claire. Henry sacrificed his health and his time, and not just to build a building. He did it because he believed in the future you could have," Raoul said, his voice cracking with the weight of the memories. Luke felt a knot form in his throat. The images of his father working under the dim light of a workshop filled with dust and sawdust came alive in his mind with painful clarity. Henry's hands, strong and steady, sanding, hammering, building. It was as if he could hear the echo of the tools and his father's heavy breathing in the stillness of the office. "Dad never told me that," Luke murmured, feeling a sharp pang of regret. "He didn't do it because he didn't want you or Claire to carry the weight of his sacrifices. He preferred that you saw him as a strong father, not as a man who struggled every day not to break," Raoul replied, his eyes wet. "But I saw it. I saw it in his eyes when he came home, exhausted but determined. I saw it in his hands, covered with calluses and scars. I saw it in the way he smiled when he mentioned your accomplishments in school, saying it was all worth it." Luke leaned forward, his head in his hands. Raoul's words were like a mirror reflecting an image he had ignored for far too long. A reflection of a child who once admired his father more than anything in the world, and who, in his eagerness to prove his worth, had distanced himself from everything that truly mattered. "Raoul, why are you telling me this now?" Luke asked, lifting his eyes, red with emotion. Raoul looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Because I think it's time you understand that the company you have, the success you've achieved, wasn't built just with contracts and ambition. It was built with love, sacrifice, and the belief of a man who never stopped dreaming of a better future for you. And if you really want to make peace with your father and with yourself, you need to remember where you come from and who helped you get here. The silence that followed was deep and full of meaning. Luke stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had come to represent so much for him. The lights from the buildings, the same buildings he had built on the foundations his father helped lay, now seemed different. They were a symbol, not just of his success, but of an older, deeper story than his own. "Thank you, Raoul," Luke said, turning to the man who had silently witnessed his entire life. "I don't know how I can repair everything I've done, but I'm going to try." Raoul slowly stood up and placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "It's not just about repairing, Luke. It's about honoring. Do it for Henry, but also for you and for Claire. You still have time to change the legacy you're building." When Raoul left the office, Luke stood still, unmoving, but with a growing resolution in his chest. It was no longer just about saving the company or making sure Hector paid for his actions. It was about rediscovering the essence of what it meant to be a Martin, remembering his father's sacrifices, and reconnecting with the family he had left behind. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Luke picked up the phone and called Claire. The line rang several times before she answered, her voice filled with exhaustion and surprise. "Luke, is everything okay?" Luke took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you. I want you to know what I'm doing and why. I want you and Dad to know that I'm going to make things right, not just for the company, but for us, for what we mean as a family." Claire remained silent, but Luke could imagine her in the hospital, sitting next to Henry's bed, waiting for promises to become actions. And for the first time in years, Luke felt he was on the right path, a path that would take him back to the home he should never have left behind. The day of the extraordinary meeting at the company had arrived. The air in the office was thick with expectation and nervousness. Since the uncovering of Hector's irregularities, rumors had spread like wildfire. Employees looked at each other, whispering theories and possible consequences. Luke, sitting in his office with a cup of cold coffee in hand, stared out at the city through the windows. The reflection in the glass returned the gaze of a man who had spent weeks on the edge of exhaustion, but who now, for the first time in years, felt like he was fighting for something bigger than himself. The door opened, and Alice entered with a thick folder under her arm. Her expression was serious, but there was a glint of determination in her eyes. "Everything's ready, Luke. The documents we'll present have enough evidence to confront Hector. This will be a meeting no one will forget," she said, handing him the folder. Luke took it and opened it, quickly reviewing the papers. Fake contracts, diverted funds, and statements from employees who had been intimidated or ignored. The evidence was compelling and left no room for doubt. Alice stood, watching him, knowing that the burden she carried wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. "Thank you, Alice. I don't know what I'd do without your loyalty," Luke said, lifting his gaze and realizing that his assistant had been one of the few people who had kept faith in him, even when he himself had lost it. Alice smiled faintly, a gesture that lightened the tension in the room. "I've always believed in what this company represents, Luke, and I know you can still recover that essence." The time for the meeting was nearing, and Luke stood up, straightening his jacket. The meeting wasn't just a confrontation with Hector. It was a turning point in his life, an opportunity to redeem not only his name, but also the legacy of his father and the family he had ignored for so long. When he entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. All the senior executives were present, their faces serious and expectant. The ceiling lights illuminated the long wooden table, where many important decisions had been made, but never one like the one that afternoon. Hector was at the end of the table, arms crossed, with an expression that fluctuated between confidence and defiance. The barely perceptible smile on his face made it clear he was prepared to play his cards to the end. Luke positioned himself at the head of the table and placed the folder in front of him, not breaking eye contact with Hector. The murmurs in the room ceased immediately. "Thank you all for coming to this extraordinary meeting. Today we will discuss a topic that, although difficult, is necessary to protect the integrity of our company and all that it represents," Luke began, his tone resonating in the room like a solemn bell. Hector leaned back in his chair and raised an eyebrow, feigning indifference. "What's this about, Luke? It seems you're about to share a big revelation," he said, with a hint of mockery in his voice. Luke didn't react to the provocation. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, projecting it onto the digital screen in the room. The image of an inflated contract, with details pointing to fund manipulation, unfolded before everyone. "Here is an example of a contract that was manipulated to divert funds to external accounts and non-existent projects. These moves are not only a violation of our company's ethics, but also a crime," Luke explained, looking at each of the executives before stopping at Hector. Hector's smile faded for a moment, replaced by a flash of anger in his eyes. But he quickly regained his composure. "Are you implying that I'm involved in this? Because if you are, Luke, you better have more than just papers." "We all know things aren't always what they seem," he replied, leaning forward and trying to sow doubt in the others. Alice stood up and walked to the screen, projecting more evidence. Intercepted emails, employee testimonies, and financial analyses that clearly outlined the chain of manipulations leading to Hector. "It's not just a contract, Hector. It's a pattern," Alice said, her voice firm, cutting off any immediate attempts at rebuttal. The executives began to speak among themselves, the murmurs turning into a constant buzz of disbelief and surprise. Hector, seeing that the situation was turning against him, slammed his palm on the table, causing a sudden silence. "This is a farce. Do you really think that I, the man who has brought more contracts to this company than anyone here, would do something so absurd?" Hector bellowed, his voice filled with contained fury. Luke watched him, seeing how the man he had once considered an ally was crumbling in his arrogance. "What you did isn't just a betrayal of the company, Hector. It's a betrayal of the people who work here, of the families who depend on its integrity. I can't allow someone like you to keep undermining what we've built," Luke said, his voice calm but filled with a determination that no one in the room had ever seen before. Two security officers who had been waiting outside entered at Luke's signal. Hector eyed them with narrowed eyes, his posture defiant, but fear was starting to show at the corners of his lips. "This isn't over, Luke. You'll regret this," Hector whispered, as the officers escorted him out of the room. The silence that followed his departure was so dense it seemed to absorb the air in the room. The executives looked at each other, some with expressions of relief, others with the uncertainty that came with the new reality. Luke took a deep breath and looked at each of them, feeling the weight of what he had done, but also the freedom of having made a decision that, although difficult, was the right one. "This won't be easy to overcome," he said, his voice softer. "But I know that if we work together and return to the principles on which this company was founded, we can move forward." The executives nodded slowly, and gradually the conversation shifted to the measures they would take to fix the damage and restore trust. Alice sat back down, a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction on her face. She knew that this meeting was not just a victory for the company, but a step toward reconciliation for Luke, with himself and with his father's legacy. That evening, when Luke returned to the hospital, he found Claire speaking quietly with James. They both turned to look at him, and Luke approached, feeling an unusual calm in his chest. "It was a tough day, but necessary," he said, his eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Claire looked at him, and though she didn't smile, she nodded in approval. She had begun to believe her brother was changing, that he finally understood what it meant to be part of a family and fight for something more than just himself. As Henry slept, unaware of what was happening around him, Luke, Claire, and James shared a moment of silence, each aware that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with new possibilities. The hospital, with its endless corridors and the constant murmur of monitors and footsteps, had become a second home for Claire. The days and nights blurred together as she cared for Henry, always attentive to any change in his breathing or expression. James regularly passed by the room, ensuring everything was under control and offering words of encouragement that Claire absorbed like a balm amidst her exhaustion. Luke, though present, usually kept to the side, silently observing the scene before him. Each gesture of Claire, every look she gave her father, was a reminder of what he had left behind. During those long hours, Luke immersed himself in his thoughts, replaying Raoul's words and childhood memories. He thought of the nights when Henry, his hands still covered in wood dust, would read him stories before bed, his tired eyes, but filled with love. The image was so vivid that he could almost hear his father's hoarse voice saying, "Work is important, son, but never forget that what we do is for the people we love." That afternoon, as the sun filtered through the windows, bathing the room in a golden hue, Henry slowly opened his eyes. His eyelids moved heavily, as though made of lead, and his gaze wandered around the room before focusing on Claire, who had fallen asleep with her head resting on the edge of the bed. Claire's breathing was soft, but every exhale carried the weight of days and nights of worry and effort. Luke, who had been sitting in an armchair across the room, noticed the movement and stood up abruptly. The noise startled Claire, who quickly lifted her head and saw her father's eyes open, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and tenderness. A faint smile appeared on Henry's face. "Dad," Claire whispered, tears welling in her eyes as they rolled down her cheeks. Henry moved his lips, but the voice that came from them was barely a murmur. "Claire, are you okay?" he asked, as if, despite his condition, his concern for his daughter was the first thing on his mind. Claire nodded and took his hand, which was still warm but trembling. James, who had heard the commotion from the hallway, entered quickly, and a relieved smile spread across his face when he saw Henry awake. "Welcome back, Henry," he said reassuringly as he checked the monitors. "You've been giving us quite a scare, you know." Henry gave a weak smile and turned his gaze to Luke, who stood slightly apart, his eyes shining with contained emotion. The silence between father and son was heavy, filled with meanings and feelings that neither had known how to express for years. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice still weak but clear. "Luke," he said, each syllable carrying a weight that only they could understand. "I didn't expect to see you here." Luke took a step forward, approaching the bed. His hands trembled and his heart raced, but he forced himself to remain steady. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything," he said, the words coming quickly, as though he had been holding them in for far too long. "For distancing myself, for not being here when you needed me, for forgetting what really mattered." Henry's eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and understanding. He remembered Luke as an eager child, always seeking his father's approval, and later as a young man determined to prove his worth at any cost. He had seen how ambition consumed him, but he also knew that love and guilt were complicated feelings that could become entangled and lead one to make the wrong decisions. "You don't have to apologize anymore, son," Henry said, weakly squeezing Luke's hand when he got close enough. "What matters is that you're here now." Claire watched the scene, her heart torn between the relief of seeing her father conscious and the emotion of seeing her brother opening a path toward reconciliation. She had spent so many years trying to get Luke to understand what it meant to be part of a family, that seeing this moment made her feel a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. James, aware that the family needed a moment of privacy, motioned to Claire, and the two of them left the room, leaving Luke and Henry alone. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything you told me when I was a kid, about the stories you shared about your life, your work." Luke lowered his gaze for a moment before continuing. "What I never understood was how much you sacrificed so I could have the chance to build all this," he said, vaguely pointing to the world beyond the window. Henry closed his eyes for a moment and smiled softly. "It was never about sacrifice, Luke. It was about love. It was about seeing my children grow and knowing that what I did was worth it, because I did it for you. When I saw you pull away, I thought I had failed, that the work I did to keep us together had been in vain. Luke bent down to be at his father's level, his eyes full of tears he didn't bother to hide. You didn't fail, Dad. I failed by not realizing what really mattered, but no more. I want to change that. I want you to be proud of me, not just for what I've achieved, but for who I am and what I will do from now on. Henry looked at him, and though the wrinkles on his face spoke of years of struggle, a spark of pride and relief ignited in his eyes. He squeezed his son's hand with all the strength he could muster. I've always been proud of you, Luke. I just wanted you to know that. The silence that followed was filled with emotions, an invisible bridge slowly closing between father and son. No more words were needed, for at that moment, in that hospital room, both knew that the words were enough to begin healing. In the hallway, Claire and James watched from the window, witnesses to a reconciliation that had taken too long to come. James placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, and without looking away from the scene, she intertwined her fingers with his, feeling that for the first time in a long time, the pieces of her life were starting to fall into place. The rest of the day passed with a lighter air. Henry, though still weak, stayed awake and conscious, sharing small anecdotes and smiling at the jokes Claire and Luke told to keep the mood up. It was a day of small victories, the beginning of restoring the broken bonds. That evening, when the hospital lights dimmed and the city was wrapped in the silence of the early morning, Luke stayed in the room, watching his father sleep. His thoughts swirled between childhood memories and the promises he had just made. He knew that words were only the beginning, that what came next would determine whether he had truly changed. But in that moment, under the faint glow of the monitor that tracked Henry's steady pulse, Luke allowed himself a breath of hope. He had taken the first step, and with it, he had opened the door to a new opportunity for redemption and family love. The sun of the new day softly filtered through the blinds in the hospital room. The golden rays illuminated Henry's face, who remained asleep, breathing with a regularity that returned some color to his cheeks. Claire, sitting beside the bed, looked at her father with visible exhaustion, but her eyes shone with a mixture of relief and hope. The last few days had been an emotional roller coaster, from the deepest fear to the comfort of seeing her family begin to heal. Claire stood up to stretch, and it was then that James appeared in the doorway. He was wearing his hospital uniform and holding a coffee in his hand, which he silently offered to Claire. She smiled and accepted the cup, feeling the warmth spread from her fingers to her chest. "Thanks, James. I don't know what I'd do without you," she said, taking a sip and closing her eyes for a moment to enjoy the bitter comfort of the coffee. James leaned against the doorframe, watching her with that mixture of concern and admiration that he had developed for her over the past year. Claire was a strong woman, a rock who held her family together with a dedication that impressed him, but behind that invincible facade, he knew there was someone who also needed support. "You should rest a little more. You've been sleeping poorly for days," he suggested gently, though he knew the proposal would probably fall on deaf ears. Claire let out a brief laugh and glanced at her father, as if to make sure everything was still fine before responding. "I know, but now that Dad is better, I don't want to leave him alone. Not after everything that's happened." James moved closer and sat in the chair next to her, his proximity comforting. He had been a constant support, not only in medical terms, but also in the moments when Claire felt she was going to break. He had been there with a word of encouragement, a kind gesture, or, like in this moment, simply with his presence. "Claire, you've done more than anyone could. No one questions your love and dedication for your father, but if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to keep helping him?" he said, leaning forward and meeting her gaze. Claire fell silent for a moment, her eyes searching his for something, as if she needed to find the validation of what she already knew, but had not dared to admit. The burden she had carried on her shoulders for years wasn't just physical, but emotional. Luke's absence, Henry's illness, and the constant struggle to balance her work and personal life had exhausted her more than she was willing to accept. "I know, James, but it's hard. After all this time being the one who cares, to think about letting someone else take control, even if it's just for a moment," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. James placed his hand over hers, a gesture that had become so natural between them that Claire didn't even flinch. "You're not alone, Claire. You've never been, even if sometimes you felt that way. And now, with Luke here, I know he also wants to be a part of this. It's time for you to let others take care of you too." James's words resonated with her in a way she had rarely experienced. She had always felt that she had to carry the responsibility of her family, first out of love, and then out of necessity. Seeing Luke step forward and commit to helping her was something that, although she still watched him cautiously, gave her a small spark of hope. At that moment, Luke entered the room, interrupting the exchange of glances between Claire and James. His expression was more relaxed than it had been in days, and a slight trace of a smile appeared on his face when he saw his sister and James sitting together. "Good morning," Luke said, approaching the other side of Henry's bed. Claire turned toward him, noticing the change in her brother. There was something different in the way he moved, the way he spoke. This wasn't the old Luke, the one always somewhere else, thinking about his business and the numbers of his contracts. This Luke was present, attentive, and that gave Claire a reason to believe in his sincerity. "Good morning, Luke. Dad has been sleeping peacefully," Claire reported, trying to sound neutral, although her voice couldn't fully conceal the surprise of seeing her brother so early. Luke nodded and looked at his father, who was still sleeping deeply, unaware of the conversation between his children. A moment of silence settled in the room, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but full of meaning. Claire realized that this was the first time in a long while that the three of them were sharing a space without palpable tension. James stood up and turned to Luke. "Henry has been showing signs of improvement. If he continues like this, we might consider transferring him home in a few weeks with proper care," he said, making it clear that although things were going well, the recovery process would still be long. Luke looked at him and nodded, with an expression of gratitude that didn't go unnoticed by Claire. "Thanks, James. I know you've done so much for him and for Claire. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for everything you've done," Luke said, with a sincerity that surprised both James and Claire. James smiled, a little uncomfortable with the recognition, and shrugged. "It's part of my job, but family is the most important thing, and I'm glad to see that you're here for them," he replied, giving Claire one last look before stepping out of the room to give them a moment alone. When James left, Luke and Claire exchanged looks in silence. There was so much to say, but the words weren't easy. Claire finally broke the silence. "He's been a good friend," she said, referring to James and in some way opening the door to a deeper conversation. Luke nodded slowly. "I know, and I also know I've failed at being one to you. But I'm here, Claire. I want you to know that this time is different. I didn't just come for Dad, but also for you. I want to be a brother you can be proud of, someone you can trust," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Claire watched him for a moment, her eyes searching for signs of falsehood and finding, to her surprise, only sincerity. She let out a sigh, and although she didn't smile, she nodded, as if with that simple gesture she was giving Luke the opportunity he had been seeking. "I'll take your word for it, Luke. Let's take care of Dad together," she replied, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt that the weight on her shoulders lightened, at least a little. The rest of the day passed with an unusual calm. Henry woke up later and was happy to see his children together, sharing stories and caring for him with a dedication that restored his strength. Luke, although still feeling awkward in his new role, made an effort to be present, to be part of that life he had left behind. James, who passed by the room occasionally, watched the scene with a contained smile. Seeing Claire share the burden and allow others to help her was a victory in itself. and although he knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, at that moment, everything seemed possible. Night fell, and Claire, after a long time, allowed herself to rest a little while Luke stayed next to Henry's bed. James, seeing that she had finally slumped into one of the chairs in the hallway and closed her eyes, approached and placed a blanket over her shoulders. Claire, half awake, opened her eyes and looked at him, her tired but grateful expression. "Thank you for everything, James," she whispered, before closing her eyes again and letting herself drift into sleep. James remained by her side, watching as the shadows of the night moved across the walls of the hospital. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but at that moment, with Claire resting and Luke committed to fixing what had been broken, he felt that they had taken an important step toward healing. The weeks passed with a more defined routine at the hospital and in the Martin family's lives. Henry showed constant improvement, and though his recovery was slow, the presence of Luke and the tireless help from Claire and James kept him motivated. Luke's visits to the hospital became a habit, and his relationship with Claire, though still fragile, was starting to rebuild. However, outside that temporary refuge, things at Luke's company were far from calm. The dismissal of Hector and the revelations of his schemes had sparked a series of reactions, from some employees' unwavering support to the anxiety and fear of others. Rumors of potential retaliation from Hector spread through the hallways, and although Luke maintained a facade of control and security, he knew he couldn't let his guard down. One afternoon, while Luke was reviewing some reports in his office, Alice entered with a more serious expression than usual. "Luke, we've received an anonymous tip," she said, placing an envelope on the desk. It was a simple white envelope, but the weight of what it contained seemed palpable. Luke looked up, frowning, before carefully taking the envelope. He opened it and pulled out a typewritten sheet that simply read, "Decisions have consequences. You're not as safe as you think." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Alice, who had seen many things in her time at the company, felt a chill run down her spine. "This could be a bluff, but we can't ignore it. Hector has connections, and he wouldn't hesitate to use them," Alice said, choosing her words carefully. Luke took a deep breath, feeling the pressure building in his chest. The image of his father and Claire, the fragile peace they had found at the hospital, crossed his mind. He couldn't allow anything that was happening at the company to affect that delicate peace. "I want you to contact the security team. I want to know what else they can find out about Hector and his recent moves," Luke said, leaving the note on the desk as if it were burning. Alice nodded and left the office, her determined stride and her mind already working on what needed to be done. Luke was left alone for a moment, staring at the note and feeling a whirlwind of emotions. He had expected the consequences of his actions to come, but not so soon, and not with such intensity. His thoughts drifted toward Claire and Henry. The idea that something or someone could harm them was unacceptable. That night, after the lights in the company went off, and only the emergency lights remained, Luke decided to visit the hospital, as he did every day. He needed to see his family, to remind himself why he was fighting. When he arrived, he found Claire in the break room, reading a book under the yellow light of a lamp. The tranquility of the place contrasted with the agitation he felt. Claire looked up when she saw him and gave a faint smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the tension in her brother's posture. Luke walked over and sat next to her, feeling the comforting warmth of his sister's presence. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, although his voice betrayed the truth. Claire looked at him with analytical eyes. She had learned to read Luke's expressions when they were kids, and although time and distance had changed them, some things remained the same. "Luke, I know something's bothering you. Is it the company?" she asked, closing the book and setting it aside. Luke let out a sigh and ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to alarm her, but he couldn't lie to her either. "There's something that could become a problem. Hector hasn't stayed quiet since we kicked him out of the company, and today I got a note. A threat, actually," he admitted, his words laden with the concern he was trying to hide. Claire's face tensed upon hearing his confession. The thought that Hector, with all his power and resentment, could pose a danger not only to Luke, but to their father, and to her as well, was terrifying. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice firm but filled with concern. "I've already taken security measures. Alice and I are working on it. I won't let any of this touch you." "That's what matters most to me," Luke said, and in his gaze there was a silent promise Claire couldn't ignore. The silence that followed was heavy, but also full of understanding. For the first time in years, Claire felt that she could trust Luke, not just as her brother, but as someone who was willing to protect his family. At that moment, James entered the room, interrupting the exchange of glances between Claire and Luke. Noticing their expressions, his usual smile faded. "Everything okay here?" he asked, looking at Claire and then Luke. Claire nodded slowly, though her mind was still processing the conversation she had just had with her brother. "Yeah, just catching up," she said, trying to downplay the situation. James, however, noticed the subtext in the room, but decided not to press. He knew that things in the Martin family were far from simple, and he would learn what he needed to in due time. The hours passed, and the night grew denser. When Luke said his goodbyes and left the hospital, a cold wind greeted him on the empty street. He got into his car, but before starting it, he looked up at the lit windows of the hospital. In one of them, he could make out the figure of Claire caring for Henry. It was an image that gave him strength, but also reminded him of what was at stake. The next day, while reviewing new security reports and trying to anticipate Hector's movements, Luke received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Luke Martin," he said, expecting it to be one of the new security contacts. The voice on the other end was low, controlled, and strangely familiar. "Luke, I thought you knew that things don't always end when you decide. You've made many enemies in your career, and not all of them stay silent." The voice paused for a moment, and Luke knew immediately it was Hector. "Hector, if you think you can intimidate me or make me back down, you're very wrong," Luke replied, controlling the fury that was starting to boil in his chest. "It's not intimidation, Luke. It's a warning. You have a lot to lose, more than you think. Take good care of what matters to you." And the line was cut before Luke could respond. The echo of those words hung in the air like poison infiltrating his mind. Luke closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He couldn't afford the luxury of doubt or giving in to fear. He had promised to protect his family, and he wasn't going to break that promise no matter how high the stakes were. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, an old picture of him, Claire, and Henry on a sunny afternoon, all laughing without a care in the world. It was a reminder of what was at stake and what he was willing to do to keep them safe. The storm that was coming would be fierce, but Luke was determined to face it, not just for himself, but for the family he had learned to value beyond success and power. The morning in the city arrived with a heavy air, as if foretelling what was to come. Luke woke up early, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a time since Hector's threat. His mind raced at full speed, considering every possible scenario and security measure to protect his family and the company. He had reinforced security at his house and at the hospital where Henry was recovering. However, the uncertainty and the feeling that something bigger was at stake kept him on edge. After a quick, bitter coffee, Luke arrived at his office, where Alice was waiting with a stack of reports and an expression that betrayed her own concern. "Luke, we've found more information about Hector's connections. He's been in contact with some former colleagues who are known for working in the shadows. These aren't just rumors. There's proof that he's pulling strings to intimidate you and destabilize the company," Alice said, handing him a report marked with a confidential stamp. Luke flipped through the papers, and each line he read confirmed what he had feared. Hector wasn't just planning revenge. He was willing to go further, putting everything Luke had tried to protect at risk. "We need to act before he takes the next step. I want to speak with our legal team and security. If Hector tries anything else, I want to be one step ahead," Luke ordered, standing up and walking back and forth in his office. Alice nodded, with the efficiency and determination she was known for. Alice had already arranged a meeting for that afternoon. She had also contacted a couple of cybersecurity specialists. "We don't know how far Hector could go, and we need to shield the company's information," she added, before leaving to continue organizing the preparations. Luke slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked again at the photo on his desk, the one he had been staring at the night before. He remembered the sound of Claire and Henry laughing, and that thought shook him. He couldn't afford to fail. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Claire was preparing Henry for his physical therapy session. His recovery was slow, but Henry, with his unshakable spirit, showed improvements that inspired everyone around him. Claire watched him with tenderness and admiration as she helped him sit in the wheelchair. "Today's a good day, Dad. You'll see, every day is one step closer to coming home," she said, gently stroking her father's hand. Henry smiled, his eyes livelier than they had been in weeks. "You've always given me strength, Claire, and now I see you're not only strong for me, but for everyone around you. I'm proud of you, daughter." Henry's words resonated deeply with Claire, filling her with warmth. However, in the back of her mind, the conversation with Luke about Hector's threat still lingered. The idea that something could disrupt the peace they had so hard earned kept her on edge. James entered the room, interrupting her thoughts. With his usual smile, he greeted Henry and approached Claire, noticing the tension in her expression. "Everything okay?" he asked softly, while adjusting the wheelchair. Claire looked at him and nodded, though she couldn't hide the flicker of concern in her eyes. "Yeah, just a bit tired," she replied, trying to change the subject. James didn't push, but he knew her well enough to realize that something was bothering her. He decided not to press, but made a mental note to talk to her later. In the afternoon, Luke walked out of the meeting with the lawyers and security team, feeling like they had done everything possible to protect the company and his family. However, the threat from Hector still weighed heavily on his mind, like a shadow. He decided to head to the hospital to see his father and Claire, feeling that he needed to be close to them, even if only for a moment. When he arrived, the hospital was relatively quiet. He walked through the halls, observing the patients and their families, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the fragility of life. That fragility had driven him to fight so hard, but now he understood that true value lay in protecting the people he loved, not in contracts or numbers. Arriving at Henry's room, he found Claire sitting beside her father's bed, quietly reading a book while Henry rested. Luke smiled at the scene, but that feeling of peace was quickly interrupted by the sound of his phone. He pulled the device from his pocket and saw an anonymous message. "Don't think the hospital is a safe place." Luke felt his blood run cold. He looked up and scanned the room, trying to identify anything out of place. He moved closer to Claire, who looked at him in surprise at the expression on his face. "Luke, what's wrong?" she asked, setting the book aside. "Claire, I need you to leave the hospital with me. Now," Luke said, his voice urgent and low. Claire looked at him, confused and worried. "Why?" "Luke, you're scaring me." Before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices came from the hallway. James burst into the room, out of breath. "Luke, Claire, there's a security alert at the hospital. Someone reported suspicious movements in the south wing," he said, looking at them both with wide eyes. Claire's heart began to race. Everything she had feared since Luke mentioned Hector's threat seemed to be materializing. Luke moved to the door and looked down the hallway, seeing several security guards moving quickly toward the south wing. "James, I need you to help Claire get Dad out of here. I don't know what's going on exactly, but I'm not taking any chances," Luke said, glancing back at his sister. "Trust me." Claire nodded, though the fear inside her was palpable. Together, she and James began moving Henry's wheelchair, who, though confused, said nothing. He knew that if his children were worried, there was a reason for it. The journey toward the hospital exit became a walk filled with tension. The hallways, which were usually a place of calm and hope, had turned into a space where every shadow and every unfamiliar figure represented a possible danger. When they finally reached the parking lot, Luke turned toward them, scanning the area with his gaze. "Alice is sending a security car to escort you to a safe place. We can't risk going back home right now," he said, keeping his eyes on the surroundings. Minutes later, a black car with tinted windows arrived and stopped in front of them. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out and nodded at Luke. "I'm part of the security team. We'll make sure to take you to a safe place," he said, opening the back door. Claire helped Henry into the car, her hands shaking as she secured the wheelchair. James stayed by her side, making sure everything was in order. Once everyone was inside, Luke leaned toward the window and looked at his sister. "Claire, I need you to trust me. This isn't over, but I will do everything in my power to protect you," he said. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "Be careful, Luke," she said, and for a moment it was as if all the time they had spent apart vanished, leaving only the unbreakable bond of family. The car started and disappeared into the night, leaving Luke standing in the parking lot, surrounded by the cold air and the promise of a storm still to come. Luke watched as the car carrying Claire, Henry, and James pulled away from the hospital, its taillights fading into the darkness of the night. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and although the air around him was frigid, the real reason for his chill was the looming threat that hung over them. Hector had proven he wouldn't stop at anything to take revenge and regain control, and Luke knew that. There was no room for mistakes. He quickly returned to the hospital, where things had started to normalize after the false alarm in the south wing. However, the tension was still palpable in every corner. The looks of the security guards, nurses, and doctors made it clear that the calm was merely superficial. Luke passed by the reception and headed to his car, with a plan beginning to form in his mind. On his way to the office, he called Alice. "Alice, I need you to arrange an emergency meeting with the security team and the lawyers. This is bigger than we anticipated," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I'm already on it, Luke. The information we've gathered on Hector is becoming more concerning. Some of his contacts have a reputation for working on the fringes of the law," Alice replied, her voice low. Luke hung up and focused on the road. The city lights flickered around him, and every shadow seemed to grow longer, more threatening. He knew the next move had to be careful and decisive. This wasn't just about protecting the company, it was about ensuring the safety of his family. At the safe house where Alice had arranged for Henry and Claire to be taken, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a modest house on the outskirts of the city, equipped with state-of-the-art security systems and guarded by security personnel who held their positions without rest. Claire helped Henry settle into a comfortable armchair by the window. Although the place was unfamiliar, the warmth of the room and the presence of James offered some comfort. "I don't know how long we'll be here, Dad, but I promise we're safe," Claire said, sitting next to her father and taking his hand. Henry looked at her with a mixture of concern and affection. "Claire, I know Luke is doing everything he can to protect us, and though it hurts me to see everything this is costing you, I trust that he knows what to do," he replied, his voice soft but filled with a certainty that only years of experience could bring. James, who had been organizing some medical supplies, approached Claire and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this as quickly as possible. Luke knows what he's doing, and we're here for anything you need," he said, offering a smile meant to calm the fear he too felt. Claire returned the smile, silently grateful for James's constant support. Meanwhile, in Luke's office, the emergency meeting was in full swing. The conference room was filled with familiar faces, but all shared the same expression of concern. On the main screen, Alice had projected a map with connections and names pointing to Hector's contacts and their possible movements. "Hector isn't alone in this," Alice began, pointing to several spots on the map. "He has support from former colleagues who have a history of legal and financial maneuvers that stretch the boundaries of ethics and the law. We can't underestimate what they might do if they decide to act with him." One of the company's lawyers, a grey-haired man with a severe expression, cleared his throat. Luke, our priority should be protecting the company's assets and ensuring no more data leaks or internal sabotage. We've already started reinforcing security systems, but we need to know if Hector has any weak points we can exploit. Luke studied the map and the connections, feeling his mind race as he searched for an angle, a crack he could exploit. Hector had been clever and meticulous, but Luke knew that no one was untouchable, and if anyone could find that weakness, it was him. Hector's always had a huge ego, Luke said, breaking the silence. And that's what we'll use. I want us to look for information that connects him to any movements he's tried to keep hidden. If we find something, we can force a deal that keeps him at bay, or at least distracts him long enough so he can't act against us. Alice nodded, quickly taking notes. I've already started the search. We've hired an external cybersecurity team that can help us track his movements and look for patterns that could give us an advantage, she reported, as real-time data appeared on the screen. Luke sat at the head of the table, crossing his arms and looking at everyone present. In the meantime, I want the security around Claire and Dad to be impenetrable. Nothing is more important than their well-being. Hector wants to intimidate us, but he's not going to touch my family, he declared, and his tone made it clear to everyone in the room that there was no doubt about his determination. The night went on, and at the safe house, Claire couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made her tense. Every shadow outside the window kept her alert. Henry, though asleep, tossed and turned, trapped in restless dreams. James, who had been reviewing Henry's medical reports to make sure everything was in order, approached Claire. "It won't do you any good staying awake all night. You need to rest," he said, his voice soft. Claire looked at him and sighed, running a hand over her face. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about everything that could happen. Luke is facing more than he should, and we're here, waiting," she said, frustration evident in her tone. James leaned toward her, his eyes fixed on hers. "You're not just waiting, Claire. You're taking care of your father, yourself, and giving Luke the certainty that, no matter what happens, you and Henry are safe. That's what gives him the strength to keep going," he said, and in his gaze there was a tenderness Claire couldn't ignore. Before she could respond, one of the security guards entered the living room with a serious expression. "Everything's under control, but we've detected suspicious movements near the property. Nothing confirmed, but we wanted to inform you so you can be prepared," he said, his voice low but firm. Claire's stomach churned. James stood up and nodded to the guard. "Thanks for letting us know. Make sure everything is properly secured and keep us updated," he replied. The guard left, and the tension in the room increased. Claire looked at James, and for the first time that night, she felt overwhelmed by the unease. "Do you think they'll come here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James took her hand and gently squeezed it. "I won't let them. No one will get close to you while I'm here," he said, and the promise in his voice made Claire feel a spark of comfort amidst the storm. Meanwhile, in his office, Luke received a call from Alice. "We found something, Luke. It's a financial move Hector made years ago, and it seems to be linked to a network of offshore accounts. If we make this public or use it as leverage, we could buy some time or divert his attention," Alice said, and Luke felt that they finally had a foothold. "Perfect, Alice. Do what's necessary to make sure this information is secure and ready. We can't afford to fail now," Luke replied, with a renewed sense of determination. The night carried on, and while the city slept, Luke, Claire, and everyone involved in this complex battle knew the outcome was near. The dawn finally arrived, painting the city in a golden glow that barely mitigated the tension from the night before. Luke had stayed in his office, going over the cybersecurity reports that arrived in his inbox and the messages from Alice detailing the progress in the plan to expose Hector. He knew what they were about to do would be risky, but there was no turning back. It was time to face the final challenge. The information Alice had uncovered about Hector's offshore accounts was the trump card they needed. If Hector was willing to play dirty, Luke was ready to respond with equal force. But this wasn't just about protecting his company. It was about keeping Claire, Henry, and everyone who depended on him safe. At 9 a.m., Luke called an urgent meeting with the company's executive team. The boardroom was filled with anxious faces, each aware of the importance of the moment. Alice stood up and began her presentation, projecting on the screen the documents detailing the suspicious transactions and accounts linked to Hector. These accounts, hidden in jurisdictions with minimal regulation, have been directly linked to our former colleague Hector. With this information, we can not only demonstrate his mismanagement and corruption, but also initiate legal action that will keep him occupied and out of our way, Alice explained, with a clarity and authority that left everyone in the room silent. Luke spoke up, making eye contact with each executive. I know these last few days have been difficult, and I understand that many of you have had doubts. But today, I ask you to trust me and this team. This is more than a business matter. It's about protecting the legacy of what we've built together and ensuring no one tries to undermine what this company represents, he said, his firmness making it clear that there was no room for indecision. The executives nodded, and one of them, a company veteran who had worked with Luke from the beginning, stood up. "We're with you, Luke. Let's do whatever it takes to end this," he said, and the murmurs of support spread through the room. With the backing secured, Luke and Alice coordinated the steps to make the information public and present it to the authorities. It would be a two-pronged attack, a formal complaint and a controlled leak to the media to irreversibly stain Hector's reputation. At the safe house, Claire hadn't closed her eyes all night, although she had tried to rest. James had stayed by her side, making sure she and Henry were as comfortable as possible. When the sun began to brighten the room, Claire felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. The uncertainty of what was happening with Luke kept her on edge. The sound of a car arriving at the entrance made her jump to her feet. She looked out the window and saw a black car, with two security guards escorting a figure she recognized immediately. It was Luke. She opened the door before he could knock, looking at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Is everything okay?" she asked, unable to hide the tension in her voice. Luke quickly entered and hugged her, a gesture that took both of them by surprise. It had been years since they had felt this close, and that contact broke the barrier of distance that had existed between them for so long. "Yes, everything's fine. We've taken measures to make sure Hector can't do anything more." "He's finished," Luke replied, pulling back and searching Claire's eyes for confirmation that she understood what that meant. Claire nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe more easily. James, who had been watching from across the room, smiled at the scene and approached. "I'm glad to hear that, Luke, but we still need to stay alert," he said, his voice professional but relieved. Luke nodded, aware that although they had taken a significant step, there was still the process of ensuring Hector was brought to justice. But at least, the immediate pressure had eased. Hours later, the news spread. The media reported Hector's shady financial connections and the complaint filed by Luke's company. The phones at the office wouldn't stop ringing, and social media was flooded with speculation and comments about the scandal. The reaction was immediate. Hector, seeing himself exposed, tried to respond with claims of innocence, but the evidence against him was too solid. It didn't take long before the authorities summoned him and started a formal investigation. As the city buzzed with the news, Luke decided to return to the hospital with Claire and Henry. He needed them to know everything was over, at least the most dangerous part. When they arrived, Henry greeted them with a smile that spoke more than any words. Despite his fragile state, there was a spark of pride in his eyes as he saw his children together, fighting for the family and what mattered. "Dad, everything's under control. Hector won't be a problem anymore," Luke said, sitting beside his father's bed and taking his hand with a warmth he hadn't felt since his childhood. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears, but not of sadness, rather of relief and love. "I knew it, son. I've always known you had the strength to do what's right. You just needed to remember why you fight, he said, his voice trembling but firm. Claire, standing beside them, felt tears falling down her cheeks, but this time they weren't out of worry, but joy. James, at the door, watched the scene and allowed himself to smile, knowing that all the effort and pain they had gone through hadn't been in vain. Over time, Luke's company not only recovered, but thrived under new leadership and vision. The ethics and values that Henry had instilled in Luke and Claire became the pillars of the company, and Luke worked tirelessly to ensure those principles would never be forgotten. After months of legal proceedings, Hector was sentenced for his crimes, and his name became a reminder of the consequences of acting with unchecked ambition and no morals. Luke, for his part, became a more humble and approachable leader, someone who valued both his family and his employees. Henry, after a long recovery, was able to return home. Claire and Luke, now closer than ever, took care of him and shared family dinners where the sounds of laughter and stories replaced the long silences of the past. James remained part of their lives, his relationship with Claire strengthened, and both found mutual comfort in everything they had been through. One afternoon, as the sun set and bathed the house in a warm golden light, Luke, Claire, and Henry sat in the garden. The fresh air and the sounds of the neighborhood filled the space with a tranquility they hadn't felt in a long time. You know, Luke, your mother always said that true wealth is in the moments we share and the people we love. I think I finally fully understand what she meant, Henry said, looking at his children with eyes that reflected a lifetime of sacrifice and love. Luke nodded, a genuine smile on his lips. I do too, Dad, and I promise I'll never forget it. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves of the tree they planted together years ago resonated as a reminder of everything they had overcome. The family, after all, had found its way back to love and unity. And so, in the heart of the city, and in the corners of a house that had witnessed so much pain and so many laughs, a new chapter began for the Martin family, one where the most important lesson was that life is built and valued together, always together. True success in life isn't measured by material or professional achievements, but by the bonds we cultivate with the people we love and the legacy of integrity and love we leave behind. Throughout his journey, Luke learns that ambition and recognition can blind him and distance him from what truly matters, family, and the values instilled in him since childhood. Facing his mistakes and deciding to protect and care for his loved ones teaches him that redemption is possible when one acts with sincerity and commitment. The story shows that no matter how far we've strayed, there is always a path back to our roots and to the people who make us who we are. It is a lesson about the power of forgiveness, the importance of recognizing our flaws, and the strength of family unity, even in the darkest moments. Thank you for joining us in this incredible story of love, sacrifice, and family redemption. Remember, true success isn't measured by accomplishments, but by the bonds we share and the values we leave in others. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can find the strength to value what really matters. See you in the next video, and keep taking care of what matters most, your family and your integrity.